Have you ever ordered a used book from an online seller on eBay, Amazon Marketplace, or AbeBooks and had the book arrive from a completely different seller? Did you receive an incorrect edition of the book, or one in significantly worse condition than described in the online listing? Was its arrival delayed by a week or more? Or was your order canceled and refunded by the seller 10 or even 20 days after you placed it, accompanied by a terse statement that the book was no longer in stock? And while searching online platforms, have you noticed multiple listings that are nearly identical, often with generic descriptions and photos offered by a variety of sellers? If those occurrences are familiar to you, you've probably encountered the growing scourge of what I call phantom booksellers. They're also sometimes referred to as bookjackers. The booksellers in question are real, in the sense that they're in the business of connecting books with book buyers, but they're also phantoms because they typically don't have any inventory of their own to sell. They're little more than brokers or middlemen selling other booksellers' inventory, usually without the knowledge of those booksellers or even the customers they sell to. At best, they're facilitators who sometimes help books that are mislabeled or books listed for sale on low-traffic websites find buyers who lack the time or know-how to conduct a thorough online search of their own for a title. At worst, they're parasites who insert themselves into transactions where they aren't wanted or needed, often defrauding customers and creating additional costs for everyone else in the marketplace. Unfortunately, the worst case appears to be far more common than the best. Let me explain how the scheme works, some of the costs it imposes on buyers and on other sellers, and a few steps you can take to protect yourself. To help make sense of what some of these scammers are doing, I need to start with a broad overview of the online used book selling market, which can be divided roughly into tiers targeted at different types of retail customers. At the bottom are the bulk resellers, who typically price their inventory very affordably and rely on high transaction volume to generate meaningful profits. Because they charge so little for their books, they have little incentive to put much effort into describing a book with specificity in an online listing, and any photos they include tend to be unrepresentative stock images pulled from a database such as Goodreads. Typically, their books are lumped into broad categories of condition. For example, fair, acceptable, good, very good, or like new, with generic descriptions full of unhelpful hedges and disclaimers, such as that the book might lack its original dust jacket, might be a discarded library book, or might have unspecified signs of wear. Also, broad statements that a book has normal or typical wear and tear are mostly meaningless without a clear reference point. Nevertheless, for buyers simply looking for an inexpensive reading copy of a book, bulk resellers provide a very useful service. For collectors, though, who value the condition of a used book, they're mostly a crapshoot. It's a gamble because you never quite know what you're going to get. Fortunately, the low prices in this first tier rarely leave one feeling cheated, and some sellers even offer reasonable return policies. Prominent bulk resellers include Thrift Books, World of Books, Better World Books, and Zoom Books. They often specialize in processing discarded library books, thrift store surpluses, and inventory overstocks from traditional booksellers. The next tier is occupied by booksellers who take the time to describe briefly, but with specificity, important aspects of the condition of each book listed for sale, accurately identifying, for example, whether a book still has its dust jacket, whether it's an ex-library copy, and significant examples of wear and tear. Some provide photos of the actual book, but many don't. Their prices tend to be a little higher than those charged by bulk resellers, but they're still very reasonable because they also prioritize sales volume over price maximization. The extra work involved in describing their books accurately provides real value to buyers, justifying a price premium over the bulk resellers. This is a very diverse tier, encompassing national chains such as Half-Price Books, as well as many small family-run operations. It also includes most small and casual booksellers on eBay, Pango Books, and whatnot. A few have brick-and-mortar stores, while many others are home-based and run it as a side hustle. It's also the tier where you have the best chance of finding significant bargains on collectible books. Many sellers in this tier lack the time or the expertise to research the value to collectors of each book they sell, so they adopt simple pricing strategies aimed at generating a desired rate of inventory turnover. They need to make room for the next batch of books they acquire. As a result, scarce first editions and author-signed copies often can be found here for well below their market value. Moving on to the third tier, it consists of professional booksellers who are relatively knowledgeable about the value of books and who selectively curate inventories of collectible titles and editions by carefully scavenging thrift stores, charity sales, and estate sales, among other sources. Their inventories tend to prioritize relatively scarce and potentially sought-after titles, and can include some truly rare editions. Some have specialized bookshops, while many others operate out of their homes or even storage units. Although it's possible to find bargains in this tier, particularly with relatively obscure books, the prices charged by these sellers tend to be significantly higher than those in the first two tiers, reflecting their knowledge of a book's scarcity and desirability, the convenience to buyers of their curated inventories, and the comfort of knowing their books are likely to be in collectible condition and accurately described in their listings. And that brings us to the final tier, which comprises an even more selective group of professional booksellers. These are the premium book dealers who maintain highly curated inventories of rare and antiquarian books that they market to buyers who aren't deterred by the prospect of spending hundreds or even thousands of dollars on a book. Theirs is a price maximization strategy, and they tend to monitor closely the price levels of other sellers in this tier. Many adjust their prices seemingly in lockstep with one another, typically upward, in a game of follow the leader. Applying and simplifying a concept from Economics 101, each tier is staking a claim to its own segment of the market's demand curve and targeting specific types of buyers in the process. The bulk resellers in the first tier are at the tail end of the demand curve, where prices are lowest and demand is highest. Most casual book buyers are relatively price sensitive, and they tend to gravitate to the bottom two tiers. At the opposite end of the curve, the premium booksellers in the fourth tier are fishing for whales. Customers wealthy enough, or desperate enough, or obsessed enough in their fandom to pay exorbitant prices for a collectible book. It's a low-volume tier because of their high prices. Since the end of the Great Recession of 2008-2009, collectible used books have seen enormous price jumps, mainly in the top two market tiers, as those sellers pursue a relatively small pool of bigger spenders. I've seen books priced at a couple $100 just 10 years ago that are now listed for 10 times that amount or more. That's a lot of inflation. Some of it certainly is driven by increased scarcity of the books, but some of the aggressive price escalation appears to be driven by opportunistic efforts to shape the market's perceptions of the value and collectability of the books, sometimes setting unrealistic expectations for collectors and sellers alike by exerting a kind of gravitational pull on the prices charged by sellers in the lower tiers, particularly in the third tier. That stretching of the price range for used books has created more room for phantom booksellers to make mischief. A typical phantom bookseller routinely monitors online platforms such as eBay, AbeBooks, Pango Books, and Amazon Marketplace for new listings from sellers who maintain actual inventories of used books. If a listing falls within parameters set by the phantom seller, the phantom creates one or more listings for the same book title, often on other platforms to reach a wider potential market. Their listings closely resemble the original, but the price is often marked up by 50% or more, and the description of the book's condition is often replaced with a more generically ambiguous one. When a customer places an order with a phantom seller, a cumbersome and misleading process is set in motion. Since the phantom doesn't actually possess the book it just sold, it must find and procure an equivalent copy from a seller who does have one, and at a price low enough for the phantom to turn a profit. The book is then shipped by the other seller directly to the customer, bypassing the phantom. In some circumstances, this can be a legitimate opportunity for enterprising phantom sellers to earn arbitrage profits off the used book market's fragmentation across different online platforms and off the inefficient pricing strategies of many sellers in the second and third market tiers. It makes books more expensive for some buyers, but it also might help them find the books more easily, serving a useful purpose. Unfortunately, many phantom sellers go beyond that by introducing elements of deception and sometimes outright fraud into their business practices that impose significant costs on the rest of the market. Consider a situation in which a customer places an order with a phantom seller who is then unable to find an equivalent, lower-priced copy of the book to fulfill the order. This is a common occurrence, as the original listing the phantom replicated and inflated the price of might have increased in price itself or been sold already to another buyer. The phantom then has several options. First, they can sit on the order, often for 2 or 3 weeks, hoping a useful copy of the book becomes available on the market during that time. This tends to annoy customers because they're often left wondering where their book is and why the phantom seller hasn't posted any tracking information for its shipment. Second, they can cancel the order with a claim that the book is out of stock and refund the customer's purchase price. This happens routinely, but usually only after weeks of attempting the first option of stalling for time to find a copy of the book. It's happened to me several times in the past few months, including just last week. A third option is that they can find a comparable copy from another seller at a higher price than the customer paid, thereby fulfilling the order, but at a financial loss to the phantom. In my experience, this rarely, if ever, occurs. And as a fourth option, they can procure a low-priced, inferior copy of the book that doesn't match the description in the phantom's listing. It might be a different edition, for example, a later reprint, a book club edition, or a paperback rather than hardcover. It might also be in worse condition than promised, or lack its original dust jacket or wrapper. I've been burned before by phantom sellers who list a book in like new or mint condition, only to have it arrive from a prominent bulk reseller without a jacket or as an ex-library book, because it was the only means the phantom could find to fulfill the transaction profitably. Alas, too many phantom booksellers choose the fraudulent fourth option. Phantom listings have proliferated rapidly over the past decade, enabled by simple custom software tools that anyone can create with basic coding skills or with publicly available generative AI models such as Claude or Gemini. Such tools simplify and automate the process of monitoring platforms for new listings to target, of replicating them as phantom listings, and of finding copies of books to procure from other sellers when fulfilling orders. Almost no human involvement by the phantom is required. It's a parasitic system at its core, and it generates easy money for phantoms who incur no costs associated with acquiring, inspecting, documenting, and maintaining inventory of their own, and who outsource to third-party sellers the logistics of shipping the books. There's always the risk of dissatisfied customers returning books for a refund, but so long as the books are reasonably close to the condition description in the typically vague phantom listings, most unhappy buyers don't bother to request a refund. Automation has also fueled some of the rapid price escalation in the used book market. Custom software bots are routinely used by some phantoms, as well as by legitimate sellers, to monitor other sellers' listings for price changes and to make corresponding price adjustments to their own listings. This can lead prices to ratchet upward in a repeating cycle largely disconnected from actual market demand for the books, and it's exacerbated by fictitious listings. Given how easy it is now for phantoms to piggyback on other sellers' listings, there's no end in sight to that deceptive practice. It seems likely to get worse in the near term, although I think there's reason for hope the situation might improve eventually. As Tiers 3 and 4 have chased bigger spenders in recent years, widening the distance between the highest and lowest online prices for many book titles and editions, it's created more room and higher profit potential for phantom sellers to price their non-existent books in the resulting gaps. This can create the appearance of a robust and finely differentiated market calibrated to the scarcity and condition of the books, particularly in the broad middle section of the demand curve, where the second and third tiers of traditional sellers operate. but it's often an illusion. Clearly, buyers are worse off when they pay higher prices to cover the transaction costs and profits of unnecessary phantom middlemen, or when they receive books that aren't what they ordered. But buyers aren't the only ones harmed. Third-party sellers, such as bulk resellers who fulfill orders at a phantom's request, can suffer also. When a phantom orders an inferior copy of a book for a buyer, it's the third-party sellers, such as thrift books, whose name is on the shipment, who often bears the brunt of the buyer's dissatisfaction, even though thrift books has done nothing wrong. It was the phantom who misled the customer. Such pernicious behavior by phantom sellers diminishes trust in large swaths of the online bookselling marketplace, encouraging buyers to adopt a caveat emptor, buyer beware mindset when it comes to bulk resellers and other legitimate sellers that provide only limited or non-specific information in their book listings. This leads buyers to be more tolerant of books that aren't quite what they ordered. They hope for a good transaction, but they don't necessarily expect one. Phantoms who operate at the lower end of the market, in particular, have learned to exploit those resigned attitudes to avoid refund requests from unhappy customers. Also, as I mentioned earlier, phantom sellers exert upward pressure on used book prices across every tier, concentrated mainly in the middle range of the market. Some legitimate sellers misinterpret the inflated price signals sent by phantoms as true indicators of the sales potential of a book, and they price their inventory accordingly. Other sellers might recognize the parasitic nature of the phantoms and, as a defensive measure, raise their own prices to limit the phantom's headroom for turning a profit, particularly in the market's more price-sensitive lower tiers. And of course, there's the ratcheting effect of the automated dynamic pricing system some phantoms have implemented. My simple advice for book collectors is to learn to recognize telltale signs of phantom sellers and to avoid buying from them if you can. My goal with this video is to help collectors and other book buyers become more aware of the phantoms and fraudsters that are starting to crowd the marketplace. I also hope it encourages legitimate sellers to do more to differentiate their book listings from those of the phantoms, giving customers more confidence in the books offered for sale. It might seem obvious for buyers to prioritize sellers who provide detailed descriptions and photographs of their books and who have strong track records of positive customer reviews, but I know from personal experience that it can be easy to overlook the absence of those things when a seller has a listing for a scarce and sought-after book at a price that seems almost too good to be true. Sometimes succumbing to that temptation has worked out great for me, but far too often the listing has turned out to be a frustrating sham. In addition, watch out for book descriptions that seem copied and pasted from other listings or that are generic sounding. Also, if a seller has a large number of books listed for sale but relatively few customer reviews, it might indicate that their inventory isn't real. Another red flag is a pattern of customer reviews complaining of lost shipments, canceled transactions, and delays in responding to customer inquiries, all of which are hallmarks of phantom sellers when they're unable to procure a book ordered by a customer. Finally, look at the seller's shipping policy. Is its projected delivery date more than 10 days in the future? Unless the seller is located in another country and subject to international customs processing, a delivery estimate 2 or 3 weeks from the date of purchase is a strong indicator that the seller might be a phantom. And the opposite is also true. Sellers that offer expedited shipping or otherwise promise delivery within a week are unlikely to be phantoms. I've found it easier to identify and avoid phantom sellers on eBay than on Amazon Marketplace, but I've been burned by them on both platforms. Fortunately, those platforms have buyer-friendly refund policies, and I don't hesitate to return a book for a refund if it doesn't substantially match the description in the seller's listing of it. It's an important and necessary recourse to hold sellers accountable for the accuracy of their listings. Those are some tips for buyers. What about the online booksellers whose inventories are being exploited by phantoms? What can they do? 2 essential things come to mind. They should invest more time and resources in providing accurate and detailed descriptions and photos of their books. They also should explore listing their books on multiple platforms to reach a wider potential market. Both of those steps would likely increase their costs somewhat, possibly necessitating modest price increases, but they would also help mitigate buyers' perceptions of risk, offsetting any price increase. Moreover, phantom sellers would have fewer opportunities to engage in the kinds of cross-platform arbitrage practices that are their main reason for existence. Buyer price sensitivity, particularly in the lower end of the market, would make it harder for phantoms to raise their own prices in response, squeezing the phantoms' profit margins. I hope you found this overview informative and useful. Let me know in the comments if you've had any experience with phantom booksellers, as well as any ideas you might have for stemming their proliferation in the used book market. Thanks for watching.